Thank you very much for having me here, and congratulations for organizing this. It's a really impressive list of speakers here, and it is not an easy task to go after Professor Balkin, of course, but I'll try. I think I will follow up on a few of the points that he's been making, and the funny thing is that I will be talking especially to the third point that he finds the least important, and this is the content regulation. But I think there's a big difference, and I would differ with him that it's a big difference in the approach that is available for the EU and the approach that is available for the United States. And I also would differ with him on the importance because I think in the long run, in the long term, I think the antitrust and the data protection are probably more important than the content regulation. But in the short run, I think the content regulation can give us the most impact. So I think it is really important to talk about these things right now, and especially now that we are talking about the DSA, the Digital Services Act, which there are very intense debates now in Brussels about, and in the capitals of the member states, of course, about how to do it and what to put in there. But I would say that the approach that we see there, the approach to the digital platforms, is already being tried a bit, and it is tried in the directive that preceded DSA for now it will be a number of years. It is Audiovisual Media Service Directive that is now in force since 2018, and right now we are seeing the implementation of the directive in the legal systems of the member states. And I would say that the new approach that has been taken by the AVMSD into the video sharing platforms, that is the first time that we are going into content regulation in the digital space, is the one of a triangle, that we are not seeing only the dichotomy between media and regulator, but we are entering another active regulatory element, which is user, the active user, who is the main force behind creating content being uploaded onto platforms. So this is the starting point for me. Now, I would a bit say about the dichotomy that I mentioned a second ago, and this is about the media and regulator. We know that in the analog world and in the world that is still being regulated in broadcasting, for example, or some other media like on-demand media, is the one where the media has all the editorial powers. And since they have all the editorial powers, also the editorial responsibility lies with them, and all the rights, all the speech rights, all the rights of expression lies with them. And then on the other side is the regulator representing the public interest here, and many ways of how these are entering into laws. But now the situation is changed, and it is the user as a new active element put in there. So the editorial powers now don't lie with the media. They lie also with the user, of course. And I'm not saying that the media here have no influence over the delivery of the content or over the content as such. But these powers are distributed. And so what the new laws, either AVMSD, currently in force, of the DSA, coming after that, are recognizing is the distribution of these editorial powers and the following distribution of the rights between media and users. And of course, when we are talking about media here, it is always a problem, so I will use the term platforms. And I will now focus on what is changing for the platforms in these new laws. Now first, let's clear the notion, what platforms actually are. There are always debates, between are there intermediaries or are there media. Many people are still calling for regulation similar to classical media, the strong direct regulation. But I think what the new laws are giving us is the answer that, at least in Europe, they are considered to be a new entity. And the new entity is in AVMSD, Audiovisual Media Service Directive, is video sharing platforms. And the Digital Services Act, the notion is about online platforms. Now, even before AVMSD, and currently still applying, there is e-commerce directive that is recognizing all the information society services. So even now, when we are talking about platforms outside of video content, outside of video sharing platforms, we are still talking about platforms as information society services. But this the e-commerce directive hasn't put any kind of regulatory framework over those platforms. There is one strong notion that is called limited liability, and that is restricting the liability of these platforms, making them liable for illegal content only if they know about that content. Now, there's a lot of talks and there's a lot of jurisprudence around how to do that, but I just would like to put that notion here, that the platforms currently have the limited liability. They have no liability over every single item of content on their services. Now, what does it mean, this new approach to platforms? What is different? So I would start with systemic kind of approach. The systemic approach means that the responsibility is systemic. That doesn't mean that you have responsibility over every single item on your service, but you have responsibility for the systemic treatment of the content. It also means that, how you are treating the distribution of content, how you are handling content which is in violation with your terms of services, with your own rules, and how you treat the users who are in violation of the terms of services. Now, why this systemic regulation? I would say that the reasons are threefold. The first is practical. There is just too much content on the platforms, and every single user can see a different kind of content. So it is really not feasible to make platforms responsible for every single item of content, which is just, it's very hard to process. And of course, from the point of view of regulator, it is very hard to find out about every single item of content that may be in breach of law, for example. The second is legal. As I just mentioned in e-commerce directive, we have the limited liability. And with this in place, and it seems that in DSA this would not change, it means that systemic regulation is probably the only way how to go about it without giving direct responsibility to the platforms for every single item of content. And the third one is, I would say, material, because I think this approach is the most protective to the rights that are involved in these processes. There are probably, at least there's a potential to balance the rights and interests and the distribution of rights and responsibilities between actors in the system. Now, let's move to terms of condition, because this systemic regulation means that you are putting many of the obligations that are required, the platforms are required to put in place through their own rules, their own terms of and conditions. Now, it means that the first line of regulation now doesn't lie with the regulator, but it does lie with the platforms themselves. And for example, in AVMSD, it is obligatory for the platforms to put the measures that are required by the directive in place through the terms of conditions. It is not that much obligatory in DSA because it deals predominantly with illegal content that is dealt with a bit differently. But also in this case, the terms and conditions are recognized. And for example, there's the notion that for the users, they need to be applied proportionally, and they need to be applied with regard to their rights and interests. Now, it also means that the platforms are required to put tools that are there for users from a perspective of consumer protection. And there are various complaints mechanisms. They are required by the AVMSD. They are also required by the draft of the DSA. There are flagging tools so the users can flag to the platform when something is they consider harmful or is in breach of law. And there are various kind of explanations. And this is important from the transparency point of view, because the user now needs to be informed about various things that are happening. For example, in complaint mechanism, AVMSD is requiring the platform to explain to the user what is happening to his complaint, how the complaint is being treated. In DSA, for example, there's a requirement when any kind of action is taken against the content of the uploader needs to have an explanation why and what is happening there. And there is the transparency, which is a very strong notion now. In the old world, analog world, we didn't have that kind of a problem with transparency, because in broadcasting, when you're monitoring broadcasting, you were just sitting there and seeing everything, that is every kind of content that there is on broadcasting. The same with other forms of media. This is not the same on the platforms, of course. The users can see different kind of content, and it is only via the algorithms, via the distribution and understanding how these work, that you can understand what actually is happening on the platforms. So the transparency now can take different forms. It's self-reports by the platforms, which is the most common way to do it. There are some requirements for that in the FMSD, but also the self-reports are coming from the platforms also because they just would like to inform the public. The problem with self-reports always is that they're not maybe entirely accurate. Sometimes they might not be truth at all, and sometimes even if there's truth written there, the frame might be such that is not much helpful. Another form of transparency is the risk assessments. These are coming now from the DSA, that the platforms need to do the risk assessments of the distribution of the content on various things. For example, the important focus is on human rights, for example, but also there are risk assessments turning toward democracy, for example, in terms of disinformation. Now, another problem is access to data from external perspective. We know that self-reports are good, but we need also access to data for other people, and especially, for example, for researchers, which is the thing that is debated very much now, and especially in the context of the Facebook whistleblower Frances Haugen talking about the problems on the platforms, and now we see parallel to that how things that the researchers are receiving from the platforms have sometimes problematic data, so the research is then damaged. So how to do that? There's always argument from the platforms that we would like to give you the data, but it's either too much of data or there's a problem with data protection. So now very much of the thinking here is aims toward finding a GDPR protective kind of data access. And for example, EDMO, European Digital Media Observatory in Florence, have now a working group where the platforms and researchers are talking together to find, to draft the guidance that might lead to it. But there's also another idea, and it was already mentioned by Professor Balkin, about auditing intermediaries. He was talking about this from a different perspective, but this idea is that you can have companies, for example, that can take data from the platforms, make them data protective, for example, and then convey those data to the researchers or other authorities. But there's another idea that we are now developing with Ben Wagner from Delft University, and we written a number of papers around that, which is about having a public authority in Europe, just one public authority, that would deal with the data, that would try to verify the data that you're getting from the platform, and and these clean data then convey to the regulatory authorities. They need them. This kind of authority would not have any competence of material things around the data. It will just focus on the data. But those regulatory authorities that have that competence would then can take the data and do their regulatory work. Now, let's turn to user as a new active element in this equation. The most important thing here is that, it is the recognition of the rights of user. As I said, in the old world, there were no rights for audience. Audience was protected from consumer protection kind of perspective, but there were no active rights there. The audience didn't have any kind of freedom of speech, for example, rights. So this is the new thing, and it is explicitly recognized in the FMSD. It is explicitly recognized in the DSA, and it also means, and explicitly, or again mentioned, it is the balancing of the rights and interest on the platforms and in these processes. And I see Oreste here, and we are always talking about that, and he's much more knowledgeable about that, so I won't go into details. But it was mentioned by Mr. Balkin already, and I think it is really important now to think how, for example, the proportionality tests will be applied in these situations. Because normally, this is idea coming from the constitutional law, but regulators are using that regularly. In the normal situation, you have a media and regulator situation, and you are trying to balance the rights in question to find a proper way how to regulate. But when you have also user there, you may have a triangle situation, not just two competing rights, but three. What to do with that? My idea is that probably there will be two tiers of those proportionality tests. One will be on the level between platform and the user, and another one on the higher level between the regulator and the platform. But this needs to be developed further. And there are also tools, I already mentioned the tools, that are obligatory for the platforms to implement. And these, of course, from the point of user, are helping for the user to navigate and be protected from the harmful content on the platforms. And what's new for the regulator? Because when things change like this, the regulator has a changed position too. Now the shift is getting towards data transparency. I talked about transparency before, but because I think it is extremely important, I need to stress it also here. The regulators need to prepare for that in either kind of situation, either with researchers or auditing intermediaries or with that auditing authority that I've been talking about. But there needs to be more transparency between regulators and the platforms. Now there's strong cooperation need. The cooperation is written in both of those directives, AVMSD and the DSA. There's a lot of co-regulatory thinking in that, so in this sense, co-regulation will be extremely needed. But there's also cooperation needed cross-sectoral, because the regulators now, the problems are, are really transgressing different areas of law. So also the regulators from these areas need to work together. And of course, cross-jurisdictional cooperation is always needed, because these platforms are global. The impacts are, in all of Europe. So the regulators need to work together to really see the benefits from the obligation from those directives in every member state. There is this strong notion of country of origin principle written into the AVMSD and the DSA, which means that only one jurisdiction, only one member state is regulating the platform. So for other member states to really feel the benefits, there's need to be this kind of cooperation. And of course, the cooperation is also on the higher level, because DSA now envisage existence of digital services coordinators on the member state level, which will be coordinating various regulators. But then on the European level, there will be EU board for digital services that will be, the EU-wide regulator, so to say, or authority over these. Now the problem is a bit, and I would mention it because sometimes it's just the elephant in the room nobody wants to address. And this is that since we have this idea of EU Board for Digital Services, there's also an idea that it will be presided by the European Commission, and also the agenda will be drafted by the European Commission, but there's a strong call for independence that I will be talking about a bit later. But the problem is that the EU Commission is a political body. So if you really want these processes to have an independence baked in it, probably we need to rethink how this board may function. And there is a notion of informational role. I think the regulatory role will be diminishing a bit because of the systemic nature of the regulation now and the platforms being the first line of regulation. So regulator will have a bit less to regulate, but it will have a more strong role in informing the public about what is happening on the platforms, how they function, and in terms of media and digital literacy. And these notions, again, are written very strongly in both directives. So the independence, once again, when we are talking about independent media, it also means that if there's a body overseeing them, there needs to be independence in place too. But in the AVMSD, it's here from 1989. There was no strong independence until 2018. But now the requirements for independence are very strong, and there are very strong requirements for the independence of the regulators in the DSA. So this is the basic outline of the triangle that we're now seeing as a shifting kind of constellation of actors in the new digital environment here in Europe. But I would like to talk about another thing, and that is the graduated approach, because so far we've been talking about a regulatory framework that is directed toward illegal content and harmful content. But there's also a kind of content that can be put under these categories. And I will be talking about disinformation, but there may be other also content that just wouldn't fit into any kind of regulatory framework. The DSA, for example, is touching upon that very lightly, but is talking a lot about self-regulation and co-regulation. So in these systems, I think the current regulators will play a role, but it is not, that strong regulatory role. So maybe instead of regulation, we can talk about governance as a slightly lighter kind of approach. But there's, for example, we have a real example of that currently in practice, which is Code of Practice on Disinformation. And currently this code is being rewritten. There will be a new version of that. And we learned something from application of this code for last 3 years. But what needs to be really there for all those sub-regulatory or co-regulatory frameworks going further is transparency. Again, I'm stressing this again, how transparency is important here. And whatever you can have the platforms to commit by themselves to do, however nice, however huge it might be, if there's no meaningful transparency behind that, if there's no data proving that the commitments are being fulfilled, then we haven't achieved anything. And this is my last thought for you for this moment. So thank you very much. And of course, let's talk about anything you would like to talk further. And I'm looking for all other presentations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ľuboš. So first, before we get to our coffee break, I would like to ask if anybody has any questions to our panelists today. Yes, I see one hand, and here's your microphone.
Thank you very much. Again, that's me again. I have a remark and a question. Remark is that if you're talking about the regulation of platforms in Europe, I think we shouldn't forget the P2B regulation, which is a very progressive one, I think. It's on a fairness for businesses on platforms, and it has really some very, very progressive solutions, like, for example, that the small enterprises have the right to get information about the ranking, the logic of ranking. And I have a question. A question is that that something is painfully missing from this transparency rules, and this is the transparency of algorithms. And I know that, of course, these platforms have, that's business trade secret. So, but still, I think that without having some kind of information or some kind of transparency on the algorithms of the platforms, I think this whole thing is not complete. What is your opinion about that?
Sure, thank you very much for the question. To the comment, yes, B2B is a very important piece of legislation. It is not directly aimed towards content, so that's why I was not talking about that, but I completely agree with you. And on the algorithms, yes, the transparency of algorithms is extremely important. Now, I haven't mentioned it, I omitted to mention it during my talk, but for example, those risk assessments that is now written in the draft of the DSA is aimed toward algorithms. And this is about, whole, data transparency kind of idea is about finding out what is going into the algorithms and then what is going out. I have many talks with researchers who are saying, I really don't need to know how the algorithms are working exactly, because probably even their creators don't know that. I need to know what is going in and what is going out, and then I can see if it's working or not. So I think if we can have a robust data transparency, we are quite safe also with the algorithms. But yes, many of these things need to be focused on algorithms too. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Someone here in the front row?
Thank you very much for your presentation again. Just quick question. If I understood correctly, you are arguing in favor that data protection should be focused more precisely. If I understood you suggesting that even after 2 years after entering the force of the GDPR, we are probably not yet there to comply with regard to the regulation, to the provisions of the GDPR. What is the way we still need to be? What is the road we still need to go on in this regard?
And are you talking about AVMSD or GDPR now?
I'm sorry, GDPR.
GDPR. Well, I think the problem with GDPR is that half of the rules, and I'm not expert in this area, so please forgive me for not being, very thorough and extremely useful here. But I think, many of the provisions are, good, and they're inspiring also for other countries. There are some things that are hindering the progress because they are too cumbersome to apply. But another thing is, and this is something that DSA tries to avoid it, is the real implementation, because there is the country of origin principle too there. So for example, many of the platforms are now based in Ireland. So it is Irish regulatory authorities that are responsible for that. And in data protection, we see this, that there are so many complaints, there are so many things to be done. The data protection authority there is very probably underfunded. So many things are just not happening because they are there. And there, other countries are now complaining about that. And there's a problem, I think, in all the platform regulation, that we may go into a situation where the problems are not treated, that the legislator may be there but is not implementing. And other member states will just take the things into their own hands, for example. And then we are losing the harmonized market. So I think there are dangers that we need to see in GDPR implementation and take those lessons in other areas.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think we are a little ahead of schedule, so we have time for a few more questions. So anyone else who would like to ask something? Yes, please, Uta, please.
Yes, I wondered how much the platforms have actually sort of fed into the Digital Services Act and how happy they are with the final outcome.
Well, we don't have final outcome yet. And they are very much involved in lobbying, of course. Now, I've seen the new numbers, and it just it had never been such an influx of money into lobbying in Brussels, until the DSA, because this is really a game-changing kind of legislation. So now they're very much involved in many of those processes. I've been attending many talks from the point of view of media regulators, and there's always platforms sitting there. So yes, I think this is one of the main concerns, because they understand that what is happening now in Europe may inspire other countries, as was with GDPR, for example. Now California has new GDPR law, so it's very probable that at least some of the states of the United States will be inspired by DSA. So yes, they are heavily involved. Now the talk, I would just add that there is this self-regulatory instrument now, like Code of Practice on disinformation, and there's the problem of motivation for the platforms. They are claiming to be very, very much interested in that. They are claiming to do a lot of those things, but then it always comes a moment where something is not possible anymore. And now you may see even the European Commission losing a bit of patience with them and saying, okay, this was our, maybe we tried with you with self-regulation, but if self-regulation isn't working, then we will have a hard law around disinformation, for example. So yeah, so their involvement is something, sometimes, it's really genuine, and sometimes it may be faked, and we just have to work with it. Thank you.
Thank you. In fact, I do have one question for you, Ľuboš. It's about transparency. So currently, we have the e-commerce directive, and Article 15 of the e-commerce directive forbids member states to oblige providers to apply automated filtering. But nowadays, the amount of content on social media platforms just cannot be handled without automated filtering and artificial intelligence. So what do you think about AI in terms of transparency, and how will the DSA resolve this problem that comes from Article 15 of the e-commerce directive?
Thank you, Kinga, for that question. Well, it is important, and there are intense talks around that, and I think probably the majority idea is to retain that kind of, to forbid use of obligation for monitoring, for automatic monitoring of the content. But the actual situation is that this is what the platforms are doing themselves. They are using the AI and this kind of monitoring to police their own platforms. So I think it is a bit short-sighted to not use something that is already being used also for some kind of protection of users, for example. So I wouldn't go that far that to require these kind of obligation. But I would like to see some kind of more flexible provision that can actually harness what the platforms are already doing in order to get a better protection for people, you know, political, very sensitive kind of thing. But, you know, if we are using, for example, for child abuse material, you know, I think there it might be quite useful.